This is Turkmenistan, a land that's extremely rich in natural resources and grand buildings, with a GDP growth rate of 6.5%, the second highest of all Central Asian states. Turkmenistan has much to offer the world. The numbers paint a rosy picture with its economy growing by leaps and bounds. I mean, how many countries in the world can show an increase in production volume by 11.5% and a retail turnover rising by 11.1% in just 1 year? What's more, investment in the national economy has jumped sky high recently, with the volume of dispersed investments rising by a whopping 20.8% compared to the previous year. Turkmenistan is on its way to certain glory, and that glory is reflected in the mausoleums and monuments decorating its grand cities, such as Ashgabat. It's obvious that the effects of these impressive numbers have started trickling down to its population, with wages experiencing an average increase of 10.4% and full funding available for the growth of pensions, state benefits, and student scholarships. So if you were born a Turkmen, you would be one lucky person, right? It seems like a veritable paradise, but there's a dark flip side to this country. Take a look at these numbers. The country scores staggeringly low on the Human Rights Index, which has a lot to do with its score on governance. This score here of 9.8 for governance on the global scale is just one step shy of Afghanistan. It proves that Turkmenistan's economic numbers tell only half of its sorry tale. They're actually a clue that the happy-go-lucky face of this country might be just a facade. So why are there two such contrasting sides to this same coin? Well, as the famed plaque on President Truman's desk said, the buck stops here. In the same way, to understand Turkmenistan's quirks, we have to look at who's running the show, meaning its leaders. Eccentricity is a bland term to describe what Turkmenistan's leaders have been up to. The country has a long and rather sordid list of presidential decrees that look more like temper tantrums thrown by toddlers. Take, for example, when its president Berdi Muhammadov, or Berdi, developed an overwhelming fear of black cars and started regarding them as the harbingers of doom. He not only banned their import, but had the ones already purchased by the people seized by the authorities. Soon, citizens were waking up to find that their black cars had been towed away in the dead of night. They had to pay jacked-up prices for mandatory paint jobs before they could get them back. Soon, this policy was extended to all colors other than white, which is why you will be greeted by a sea of white vehicles if you're ever lucky enough to visit. Coming to which, if you ever need to go live in Turkmenistan, beware. Going in might be easy, but it's the coming out part that gets dicey. There's an entire story behind this word of advice, and it has a lot to do with skilled labor and educated professionals leaving Turkmenistan in droves in 2018. Not a new phenomenon, since many developing countries experience such an exodus from time to time, but Turkmenistan had a unique way of handling its flight of talent. Instead of addressing its causes, its attempt at a solution was akin to eliminating a fly with a bazooka. It simply banned anyone from leaving, essentially also imprisoning expat professionals within its borders. But Berdi's quirks are pretty angelic compared to his predecessor Niyazov's. We'll get back to that a bit later, though. What you need to know is that this country is an absolutely insane dictatorship, one that doesn't make sense on a whole nother level. It's actually out of control. What's strange is that the Turkoman past shows that this nation wasn't born to play the role of puppet to a master. The rich history of resistance to outside rule is a testament to the country's warrior nature. These were a bunch of unruly banditing and slave trading, rough tribespeople who lived by their own laws and bowed to no one. So which straw broke this camel's back? And why has a once proud and independent people accepted such tyrant control over their lives? To understand that, we have to very, very briefly return to Turkmenistan's past, when the seeds of its suffocating future were first sown. And if you haven't already noticed, you're watching another Republic exclusive. From resistance to subjugation, these seeds can be traced back to colonial times of the 16th century. Just as the plague of European imperialism was sweeping across Africa and Asia, its shadow was fast looming over the Central Asian states from this country, Russia. The Russian Empire ruled much of Eurasia from its inception in November 1721 until its dissolution in March 1917. At its height in the late 19th century, it covered about 8.8 million square miles, roughly 1/6 of the world's landmass, earning it the title of the third largest empire in history, behind only the British and Mongols. But that was after it had gobbled up its neighbors. In the 16th century, Mother Russia had been hungry for more land, before she locked onto her easiest prey, Central Asia. Located at the Russian Empire's feet in the east, Central Asian states presented a very tempting morsel for the expansionist designs of this growing empire. All it wanted to do was to help its southern frontier advance, secure its economic interests, and enhance its global stature, for which Russia had been gradually expanding its dominion over Central Asia. Nestled within that tightly packed landmass was this landlocked country, Turkmenistan. This wasn't the first time the Turkoman tribes had been targeted by an empire. When the Russian Tsar turned his covetous attention to Central Asia, Turkmenistan was divided under the rule of two entities, the Emirate of Bukhara and the Khanate of Khiva. The two were eventually defeated by the Russians after a long century of failed invasion attempts, with Bukhara biting the dust in 1868 and the Khanate following close. In its footsteps in 1873, all said and done, however, the Turkmen area was left to its own. So why all this fuss over a landlocked area? Well, judging by its name, Central Asia has enjoyed a central location between four historical seats of power. Due to its central location, it has represented easy access to trade routes, which could also be used as lines of attack to all the regional powers. Because of this very reason, it has been continuously vulnerable to attack from all sides throughout its history. For the Russians, the steppe in its north was its most desired feature, which provided an easy launching pad for rapid mobility to any force, first for nomadic horseback warriors like the Huns and Mongols, and later for Russian traders, who were later supported by a railroad system. As the Russian Empire expanded to the east, it would also push down into Central Asia towards the sea in search for warm water ports. Turkmenistan was sitting smack bang in the middle of this high-value territory, and it was only a matter of time before it shared in the fate of its sister nations. While Russia was moving to extend its influence over the Central Asian states, the British hurried to reinforce their hold over the subcontinent of India, triggering what was called the Great Game, which was essentially a competition between Great Britain and Russia to establish footholds in other areas and call them their own. Up till that point, the Turkoman nomads had been free to roam around and indulge in their favorite pastime of running bandit groups and profiting from a burgeoning slave trade. But all of that changed on September 9th, 1879, when Mother Russia decided to cement her stronghold by taking over the whole of Central Asia, Turkmenistan included. The conclusion of the Grand Russian design came with Russia turning the full force of its considerable military might on Gök Tepe, which is present-day Turkmenistan. It was not an easy target, one that had survived many such attempts before, due to the whole city being encircled by an 18 feet thick and 10 feet tall wall made out of mud, protecting its 40,000 or so Turkmen citizens. Formidable though it was, the Russian war machine was no match for the simply constructed yet incredibly strong wall. As the battle raged on, the limited Russian troops were running out of supplies fast and had suffered some pretty heavy losses from the fierce defense put up by the Turkmen. They had no choice but to beat a strategic retreat to their base on the Caspian Sea, marking Russia's first major loss in 164 years. Though the Russians didn't have much of a chance of breaching that wall, Turkmenistan was its gateway to glory, and it wasn't about to give up on its full Central Asia control due to a puny little country. So it launched another attack 2 years after its first defeat in January 1881, which was far more calculated. This time, they focused more on brains than brawn, and they achieved victory by detonating a tunnel packed with thousands of kilograms of explosives beneath the city's wall. What followed was a ruthless massacre of the city's residents at the hands of their new invaders and masters. This set Turkmenistan's fate in stone, and finally, in the 19th century, the Imperial Russian Army finally conquered all of Central Asia and named it Turkestan. How does that tie in with the social and political atmosphere in present-day Turkmenistan? Let's tie together by taking a trip into the decades following its colonization and look at the factors which shape the now so docile nature of its people. On to servitude. Life under occupation was no joyride, and this one was particularly barren for the Turkoman, as Turkestan was pretty much neglected under the Tsar's rule. The only additions to any luxuries the Turkmen might have enjoyed was an extensive railroad network extending into the desert terrain, which made up 90% of its landmass up to cities like Ashgabat. By the time the First World War rolled around, a few cotton gins, leather processing facilities, and a single steam engine manufacturing plant made up Turkmenistan's entire industrial sector. Hey, by the way, are you enjoying this video? Do us a huge favor and hit that like button. Also, make sure you subscribe and tap that bell notification icon so you never miss out on more mind-bending content. In 1916, Tsar Nicholas II conscripted Turkestan's Muslim fighters for his losing battles, sparking widespread revolts in Central Asia. The Russian Revolution intensified the unrest, and by 1925, the Turkmen Soviet Socialist Republic was established. The Soviet regime confiscated land, forced nomadic Turkmen into state-run farms, standardized their language, and crushed tribal identities, imposing a uniform Soviet philosophy. This period really changed the mentality of the Turkmen. The society went from being full of zeal for their freedom to a very docile, passive nation. Call it fate or chance, but Turkmenistan's experience as a Soviet satellite wasn't entirely bleak, however. During World War II, Soviet industries fell to German onslaught, which caused them to be relocated to Central Asia, including Turkmenistan, boosting its economy with new factories. However, the Soviet Union now had a regionalization policy, which distributed the Central Asian states into distinct economic zones based on their natural resources, skilled workmanship, and geographical advantage. This regionalization policy relegated Turkmenistan to cotton production due to its perfect climate and terrain. At this point, the country's water problem needed to be addressed in order to sustain the cotton production. So the construction of the Karakum Canal from 1954 to 1967 took place in order to triple arable land. In the 70s and 80s, the canal was extended to reach the Caspian Sea coast, making its total length 870 miles. Today, it is revered as one of the most extensive water supply canals in the world. With the water problem solved, human labor was the next problem. The Soviets had the perfect solution to this pesky little problem, and little children were summarily lifted from schools and transported to cotton fields to help collect it. Easy peasy. By 1988, children were missing up to 68 school days a year to work in the cotton fields, a tradition its brand spanking new rulers had kept alive. Now, with all this cotton, the Soviet regionalization policy called for 97% of it to then be shipped directly to Russia, which reaped all the benefits, while Turkmenistan was deprived of its raw materials. That wasn't the only resource Turkmenistan was stripped of, though. By the 1960s, enormous reserves of natural treasure were found in the country. By natural treasure, we're talking about 50 trillion cubic meters of natural gas. Becoming owner of the fourth largest reserves in the world and the second highest on a per capita basis should have changed the country's economic fate, but guess again. By the 1980s, Turkmenistan's natural gas production was second only to Russia's, yet the Soviet Union paid a pittance for it. In fact, the Turkmen were paid 300 times less than the global market price for it, stunting the country's economic growth. The people of the country were living just below the poverty line at that point. Turkmenistan's population remained impoverished despite achieving full literacy, with poor life expectancy and high infant mortality rates highlighting the republic's social struggles. The government responded by inflating statistics to gain favor within the Communist Party, but this backfired, leading to an anti-corruption crackdown in 1985. This allowed Sapar Murat Niyazov to rise to power as the first secretary of Turkmenistan. Hopes for change were quickly dashed as Niyazov transformed the Communist Party into a rigid dictatorship. While neighboring republics experienced uprisings and reforms, Turkmenistan's people, demoralized by decades of Soviet control, accepted Niyazov's tightening grip during the 1990s. By the time the Soviet Union collapsed, Niyazov had complete control over Turkmenistan. On October 27, 1991, Turkmenistan declared independence, and Niyazov became president in a rigged election, replacing the Communist Party with the Democratic Party, but maintaining the same authoritarian regime under a new name. However, it was merely a rebranding of the same autocratic regime. Turkmenistan's independence was marked by continuity in its authoritarian rule, with Niyazov tightening his grip on the country. A wolf in sheep's clothing. As you know, a leopard doesn't change its spots. and Niyazov took that adage to heart. His first order of business after changing offices was to keep all of the Soviet mechanisms of control in place for himself. You can see really clearly now that the communist system had left in name only, leaving its remnants behind in the form of Niyazov. His first step in office of replacing the statues and images of Marx and Lenin with himself should have been taken to heart. His death grip on Turkmenistan was final, and there was no getting away from his control along the length and breadth of the land. The economy became a hostage to his rules, with everything like prices, wages, exchange rates, and international trade getting controlled by the executive branch. Niyazov did give a lot to his country, though, like the 1992 Constitution, which established a presidential system and guaranteed religious freedom. It also guaranteed a free media, which referred to him as His Excellency Saparmurat Turkmenbasi, President of Turkmenistan and Chairman of the Cabinet of Ministers, which turned out to be his title. Now, that could all have been swallowed without question by the public, had it paid off in terms of making the economy better. Instead, Niyazov directed all of his resources and energy towards strangling political and social change by banning parties, eliminating political opponents through the secret services, and cutting off all communication with the outside world to isolate the people. Much of his tactics were a page directly torn from this guy's book, Kim Il-sung. Both leaders were going neck to neck in this race. In fact, the media called Turkmenistan only second to North Korea in terms of its isolation from the world. Niyazov was increasingly seen as successful in consolidating his power. He defended his authoritarian methods by arguing that political diversity was less important than maintaining economic stability, insisting that any other approach would lead to chaos. However, despite his claims, it was obvious that Turkmenistan's economy was on the verge of collapse. Corruption was widespread, with Transparency International ranking Turkmenistan as one of the most corrupt countries in the world, placing it in a horrific 161st position out of 180 nations. Economic woes. Within the first 6 years of Niyazov's rule, Turkmenistan's economy had contracted to less than half of its 1991 level. His plan had been brilliant to his own simplistic thinking. He basically thought that he would be able to keep the local population happily sedated with subsidized food, gas, and electricity, easily financed by selling Turkmenistan's gas at exorbitant prices to Russia. The first decade of his rule was spent twiddling his thumbs and not making any efforts to diversify his consumer base. Also, the country didn't have the capacity to refine or sell its raw materials for which it depended on its previous benefactor, Russia. He didn't even try to establish a railway route to Iran, the country's closest neighbor. Meanwhile, Russia fully understood Turkmenistan's dependency, which it exploited by offering it significantly lower prices than those on the international market. They knew the country was desperate to sell its resources, and while Russia paid for 50% of the goods with currency, it would send the rest of the payments in the form of its physical goods as well. Believe it or not, sometimes it wouldn't even pay at all. It got really bad when Gazprom, Turkmenistan's biggest buyer, limited its purchases to 11 billion cubic meters per year, merely an eighth of Turkmenistan's pre-independence production levels. Then, 1997 brought its own watershed event, as former Soviet republics couldn't make their payments to Turkmenistan due to financial crises. These outstanding payments represented 80% of Turkmenistan's total GDP, dealing a severe blow to the nation's already doomed economy. Their gas exports went to a measly nil, while its cotton production declined by 50%. This was the death blow, to say the very least, leaving Turkmenistan teetering on the edge of disaster. The cash-strapped nation couldn't buy supplies like fertilizer, tractors, and cotton-picking machines, trashing its agriculture sector, which was the backbone of its economy. Niyazov's nonsensical policy of providing free water to his citizens and farmers led to such irresponsible use that it created a severe water shortage, resulting in a 43% drop in output per acre over 7 years. By this point, both of Turkmenistan's key industries were in ruins, and its effects were appearing on the public. To bring the country back from its edge of collapse, the first rail connection with Iran was established, providing access to the Persian Gulf in 1996. Then, by 1997, a 125-mile pipeline was in place to connect Turkmenistan's gas fields to Iran. But this deal didn't turn into real profit, as exports couldn't even reach 1/3 of the pipeline's capacity due to Iran's inability to make payments. Though this scheme didn't pan out, Another plan for building a pipeline to transport 33 billion cubic meters of gas over 1,000 miles to Pakistan and India took shape, and an even more ambitious plan to establish a trans-Caspian pipeline for transporting gas beneath the Caspian Sea through Azerbaijan and Georgia to Turkey and onward to Western Europe. Though the ambition flopped due to transit fee issues, it did lead to a meeting between Niyazov and the US during President Bill Clinton's term. Though the deal fell through, it did make Moscow nervous, which liked having Turkmenistan where it could squeeze it. It didn't want to lose its favorite punching bag and decided to modify its old colony by offering it a better deal. This led to turning Turkmenistan's trade deficit into a surplus. And then, by the 2000s, a slew of modern industries were appearing on Turkmenistan's landscape, including modern textile industries, domestic food production units, and the renovation of an old Soviet-era oil refinery. The economic boom experienced by Turkmenistan led to a new era of economic relaxation for its people, and should have propelled Niyazov to open it to political change like he had always promised. Sadly, again, he had other plans in store for the country. With the complete governmental structure in his pocket and the media kowtowing to his every whim, Niyazov had effectively consolidated his grip over each and every aspect of Turkmen life. Now, it was time to leave his personal stamp on the social fiber of Turkmen society. He started doing that by using the massive government machinery and the state media to establish a personality cult around himself. The media had to toe only one line, which began and ended with singing the president's praises. That was all very well, but Niyazov wanted to rebuild the entire society in his own image. On the 10th of August, 2002, the government of Turkmenistan adopted a law to rename all the months and most of the days of the week everywhere that Turkmen state-owned media was present. Publications in languages other than Turkmen were also made to use the new names, with the old names sometimes written in brackets. The names were chosen according to Turkmen national symbols as outlined by the Turkmenbasi, aka Niyazov. Now, how did he propagate these new cult ideas on the people? Easy. He decided to write an extensive memoir and make them all learn it by heart. Enter the Runema, or in English, Book of the Soul. This was a 2-volume work written by His Excellency himself. Seemingly, Niyazov had a prophetic vision in which prominent Turkmen ancestors had urged him to lead the people of the country to the golden path of life. The divinely guided Runama was declared by Niyazov as Muqaddisha, or divine, and that it would be the second landmark text of Turkmens after the Quran. All that storm in a teacup was actually over a book, which some critics suspect was actually ghostwritten. The book was soon getting pushed as mandatory reading in the country. Copies were placed in all libraries and governmental offices, but soon its teaching became a must, with exams being conducted on the volumes. Back in those days, if you went for a driving test, you would also be tested on your knowledge of the Runema. It was that crazy. Niyazov brought the entire education system to a standstill for the Runema, cutting funding and partially dismantling it for reforms on the face of it. But the actual goal was to make the Runema a necessary part of all educational curricula so he could ideologically indoctrinate the population. Think about this. The Turkmen State University even had a department of the Holy Runema of Turkmenbasi the Great. Runema studies were also pursued as a major research agenda in the country, though its scope was purely local. Those caught criticizing the book in any way faced up to 5 years in prison. And like a good dictator, Niyazov played the religion card by claiming that those who read it 3 times would get a one-way ticket to heaven. To emphasize its universal significance, a copy was even launched into orbit around Earth as a bizarre symbolic gesture. Meanwhile, all cities were getting revamped. Niyazov renamed the town of Janga and city of Krasnovodsk after his nickname, Turkmenbasi. He also renamed schools, airports, and Ashgabat streets. Not satisfied with that, he went on to naming even a meteorite after himself and members of his family. Additions were made to the national anthem of Turkmenistan to refer to him, and physicians were ordered to swear an oath to the president instead of the Hippocratic oath. It was evident that the way to the president's heart was through his ego, and everyone fell in line. Remember the city getting a makeover? This time, Niyazov started getting even more extreme. His statues and portraits were cropping up everywhere throughout the country. Look at this one, a rotating $12 million golden statue of himself that always faces the sun in Ashgabat. If that wasn't enough, he even gave every citizen a watch with his portrait in the dial. Other outlandish monuments soon dotted Turkmenistan's landscape, which included Asia's largest mosque, built at the cost of $100 million. A vast man-made lake in the desert, a cypress forest to counter desertification, a ski resort, and a 40-meter ice palace. It's a never-ending list. His eccentricities and oddities were so profound that they soon caught the eye of the West, but not in a good way. He developed somewhat of a reputation as a despotic leader, using the nation's wealth to glorify himself while the population suffered. That criticism bounced off of his Teflon exterior with ease, as he merely shrugged any comparisons with Stalin's repressive tactics away, saying that while Stalin had squashed public opinion and forced obedience from the public, he had gained popularity because of the public's love. On December 28, 1999, a parliament composed of Niyazov's hand-picked ministers was sworn in, which bestowed upon him the title of president for life. Flushed with new money, the only constraint to his unchallenged use of power was gone. Niyazov let loose the true magnitude of his delusional tendencies. He fancied himself the spiritual and cultural father of his nation and proceeded to ban ballets, operas, beards, lip-syncing in films and cinemas for not aligning with Turkmen culture, and closed all schools offering education in foreign languages. He introduced a new Turkmen alphabet, replacing Cyrillic, to break away from Russia influences. Niyazov's eccentricities escalated when he required all state employees to prove their Turkmen racial purity going back 3 generations, leading to a mass exodus of skilled Russians. After experiencing heart problems, he banned public smoking and mandated a 37-kilometer walk of health for all citizens and politicians. His image became ubiquitous, featured on portraits, statues, currency, postage stamps, airplanes, and even in train cabins. His grandest indulgence was importing Italian marble to construct monuments, mosques, luxury apartments, and gold-domed palaces. Ashgabat, the capital, earned a Guinness World Record for having the highest density of white marble buildings, with 543 structures covering 4.5 million square meters. According to Guinness, this equates to 1 square meter of marble for every 4.87 square meters of land. Ashgabat's main avenue showcased 22 5-star hotels, despite the country rarely allowing visitors. Entire neighborhoods were demolished to make way for these projects, leaving residents without compensation or adequate housing, forcing them into shantytowns plagued by opium addiction due to unchecked drug influx from Afghanistan. In rural areas, child labor remained widespread, although free gas, electricity, water, subsidized food, propaganda, and fear kept the public subdued. This fragile stability collapsed on November 25, 2002, when Niyazov's motorcade was attacked. The failed assassination led to severe reprisals, with hundreds facing show trials, disappearances, and increased oppression. Surveillance intensified, car radios were banned, and women under 35 couldn't travel abroad without 2 children. Niyazov's paranoia led to the closure of hospitals, kindergartens, and libraries outside the capital. He also targeted doctors, replacing healthcare workers with untrained military personnel, reducing mandatory schooling and slashing pensions, plunging the nation into deeper poverty. Reports surfaced that Niyazov had been siphoning gas revenues into offshore accounts. Niyazov's reign ended with his death from an illness that doctors may have been too fearful to treat aggressively. His successor, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov, took over, marking the end of Niyazov's dictatorial chapter. Another delusional dictator. And so, on December 21, 2006, Gurbanguly Berdimuhamedov was appointed acting president. We'll call him Berdi for short. So, Berdi had been a well-known figure in the old elite, having been Niyazov's personal dentist for some time. Obviously, the two had a good relationship because it had paved the way for Berdi's entry to Turkmenistan's power corridors. He had risen through the ranks pretty quickly, becoming deputy chairman of the cabinet of ministers, utilizing his time and position to dismantle the free healthcare system. He was obviously the elite's guy that trusted him with maintaining the status quo as power transitioned in 2007. All pseudo-democratic politicians use rigging to ensure that they come to power under a thin veneer of democracy, and Berdi took the same well-trodden path. The only silver lining to this cloud were the steps Berdi took to reverse Niyazov's most extreme decrees. He soon found favor with the general public for reinstating pensions, sickness, and maternity benefits, and lifting bans on opera, cinema, and ballet. He went on to reopen hospitals in rural areas and restored mandatory education in schools. All of Niyazov's renamings were reversed to their previous titles. The Runama became a bad memory from the past, just like Niyazov's portraits and statues. But it was a short reprieve, as gradually, Bernie started replacing all of the symbols of the past leader with his own writings and images. The most important of Bernie's achievements was the construction of a new gas pipeline in 2009. Spread over 1,000 miles, it went through Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, ending at China. This was supplemented by 2 additional pipelines by 2015, increasing Turkmenistan's capacity of delivering gas to 55 billion cubic meters annually. This new connection proved highly lucrative for Turkmenistan, which had experienced a drastic decline in Russia's imports due to an explosion of the pipeline and decline in European demand due to a financial crisis. The reduction led to Turkmenistan changing its trade partners, and by 2015, China was purchasing 95% of Turkmenistan's gas exports. Turkmenistan was flying high, its economy growing by a staggering 19% annually due to revenues from gas exports approaching $10 billion. This should have translated into a windfall for the country's beleaguered people. But like all dictators, Bertie wanted something else. Somewhat of an exhibitionist, Bertie wanted all the attention and embraced the drama that was needed. Swimming in new wealth, he started spending money on marble mausoleums and offbeat architectural wonders, such as a new $2.3 billion airport shaped like a falcon, big enough to accommodate 14 million tourists, who would have beaten down the gates of his tourist paradise. Speaking of which, how can we not mention the Avaza tourist zone? It was Bertie's dream to make another Las Vegas-styled strip on the edge of the Caspian Sea, complete with casinos, resorts, convention centers, sports complexes, and water parks. All made out of marble, of course. However, he did make it too hard for tourists to enter the country, with only 10,000 people getting allowed to tarnish Turkmenistan's marbled beauty, with most of them being oil and gas experts. Learning from his predecessor, he also wrote a book of his own, but thankfully didn't impose it on people. A self-styled admirer of beautiful things, he banned satellite dishes and air conditioners in the capital because they spoiled the beauty of his marbled jungle. To enhance its beauty, he chose to decorate it with the most beautiful thing of them all, gold statues of himself, his horses, and his dogs. Besides commissioning new buildings, Bertie's favorite pastime was diverting funds into his offshore accounts. Like his predecessor, he won a landslide victory against non-existent opponents in 2012 by winning 97% of the votes. Now, despite reaping immense riches from its energy exports, Turkmenistan's economy did not diversify, continuing to rely on gas revenues. But soon enough, the shale revolution came about. It refers to when the United States significantly increased its production of oil and natural gas. This led to an increase of 1.6% in GDP of the United States back in 2011. At the time, it really shook up the energy market. It caused OPEC, which is the organization of the petroleum exporting countries, to increase its energy production in order to defend its market share. This caused a drastic reduction in oil and gas prices. During this time, Turkmenistan's exports dipped to half, taking with it a fifth of its economy. Within weeks, a budget surplus of 10% GDP evolved into a 3% deficit, since the government refused to change its spending habits in line with its fluctuating economy. But things came to a head with the suspension of gas exports to Russia between 2016 and 2019. Then, within a few months, basic necessities like flour, cooking oil, and sugar were running low and had to be rationed. There were massive layoffs in Turkmenistan's state-owned industries, pushing the unemployment rate to 70%. By 2018, the rate of inflation had reached as high as 294%. How did the government respond to this crisis? Well, it just permanently revoked all free facilities. But it gets crazier. At a time when people were forced to stand in lines to get basic groceries, the government was busy building a $2.3 billion Turkmen Autobahn motorway. The 8-lane motorway was a seriously miscalculated move, but it was the first of many. Next was a stellar decision to steal money from its people. And so, starting in 2017 for the next 6 months, 20% of salaries from employees in the oil and gas sector were set aside to cover the expenses of hosting the Asian Indoor and Martial Arts Games of 2021. They even dipped into the nation's funds set aside for orphans to fund school renovations. That year, the practice of sending out school children to help in the harvest drive came back in full force, and the practice is still ongoing. In fact, the government has also been accused of abusing its powers in its dealings with the farmers. The Business and Human Rights Resource Center noted in 2022 that the Turkmen government requires farmers to submit a certain quota of cotton each year. If they are unable to meet the quota, the land is either taken away from small farmers and given to others, or a fine is issued. The government even uses its monopoly to control the purchase and sale of cotton at artificially low prices. While the economy experienced such highs and lows, the only constant has been the country's low social and political progress. Berdy continued to use Niyazov's mixed bag of suppression tricks, like forcibly disappearing political opponents and regular purges of party actors, in his disfavor. In 2018, it was widely reported that Berdy's officials had stolen $23 billion and put them in offshore accounts. This information becoming public was very ill-timed, and in a surprising move, Berdy stepped down from his position in 2022. Once again, instead of holding truly democratic elections, his son Serdar ran for the presidency and unsurprisingly secured a 73% majority. There were great hopes attached to Serdar's reign, which began in the midst of geopolitical tensions due to the pandemic lockdowns and fluctuating natural gas prices. That's because, under his leadership, revenues began to climb once again. But his presidency couldn't take the load of the elite's expectations, as somehow he failed to deliver on their requirements and corruption. This time, the presidency was affected by renewed interest in Turkmenistan's gas resources, which began to re-emerge. As a result, believe it or not, within just 11 months of stepping down, Berdy was back, holding the seat of power as the national leader of the Turkmen people, replacing his son's authority with his own once again. Enjoyed the video? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button as we leave you contemplating man's obsession with absolute power. Now, click a thumbnail to dive right back into more fascinating content.